When I woke up after surgery, the nurse told me my family had been by. I smiled at first, thinking they cared. Then I noticed the missing ring from my finger, and my purse wasn't where I left it. Later that day, I overheard two of my sons arguing in the hallway. That's how I found out they sold my house while I was still in the hospital. My name is Edith Parker. I'm 72 years old, and I built that house brick by brick. They thought I'd be too weak to fight back. They were wrong. The next morning, I pretended to be asleep when the doctor came in with my sons. They spoke in low voices, but I caught pieces of their conversation. Something about finalizing and documents. My heart beat faster, but I kept my face still. They thought I didn't understand much anymore. I'd let them think that. The doctor told them I could leave soon, maybe in 2 days if my heart stayed stable. My older son, Dean, smiled with relief that didn't look real. I knew that look. It was the face of someone hiding something. When they left, I turned my head toward the window. The morning sun touched the glass, but the warmth didn't reach me. I had nowhere to go now. My home, our family home, wasn't mine anymore, or so they said. I tried to remember the last time I saw it. The smell of the lilacs outside the kitchen, the creak in the hallway floor. My husband built that house for me before he passed. I told myself not to cry. I'd already lost too much to tears. This time, I would lose nothing else. When the nurse came to check on me, I asked her for my purse. She looked around and frowned. "Your family took it for safekeeping," she said. Safekeeping. The word burned inside me. I smiled politely and thanked her. She patted my shoulder, saying I was lucky to have such helpful sons. I wanted to laugh at the irony. I wasn't lucky. I was betrayed. I stared at the ceiling, trying to plan what to do next. Weak or not, I wasn't going to let them erase me from my own life. Not quietly. 2 days later, they discharged me. Dean came to pick me up. He brought flowers and that fake smile again. My younger son, Miles, wasn't there. Dean said he was busy sorting papers. That told me enough. Papers meant signatures, and signatures meant my name on something I didn't sign. I held on to my small bag of clothes and walked beside him slowly, pretending to need his arm. I could feel his impatience, like he was doing me a favor. He had no idea I was memorizing every word, every lie. Outside the hospital, the air smelled clean after rain. I took a deep breath and watched people hurry by with their umbrellas and phones. It felt strange to stand there, free, but not free at all. Dean opened the car door for me and said he'd take me home. I asked him which one. He hesitated before answering. That pause told me the truth. My home was gone, and he didn't know how to say it. I nodded quietly. I'd let him drive me anywhere. For now, I needed to see the full picture first. We stopped at a small apartment building I'd never seen before. Dean said it was temporary, just until they figured out next steps. He said it kindly, but I could hear the control underneath. Inside, the apartment was neat but empty of soul. The furniture looked borrowed. There were no photos, no smell of home-cooked meals, no warmth. I nodded as he spoke, pretending to be grateful. I noticed he kept glancing at his phone, waiting for something. Maybe a message from Karen, my daughter-in-law. I'd always trusted her most. Maybe I was wrong. When Dean left, I walked through the apartment alone. The floor creaked differently, sharp and unfamiliar. On the table, I found a stack of unopened envelopes. One was from the utility company addressed to me at my old house. I opened it and saw a due notice. If my house had been sold, why was the bill still in my name? I felt my pulse quicken. Something didn't add up. I placed the envelope in my bag and sat down on the couch. I had to be careful. I couldn't confront them without proof. Later that night, I called Miles. His voice sounded tight, nervous. I told him I just wanted to hear his voice. Nothing else. He said he was busy but would visit soon. Before hanging up, I heard someone whisper behind him, a woman's voice. Karen. That confirmed it. She was involved too. My chest ached. Not from my surgery, but from disappointment. I raised those boys to be better than this. But now, I had to think like them. Quiet, strategic, patient. I would find out everything before they realized I already knew. The next morning, A nurse from the hospital came by to drop off my discharge papers. She smiled and handed me an envelope that had been mixed in with my things. "This fell out of your old purse," she said. Inside was a folded bus ticket from 1999. I frowned at it, confused. That year meant something. It was the year my husband, Frank, passed away. The same year he'd told me about a box he was leaving for me in the attic. My heart skipped. Maybe there was more to this than they realized. I placed the ticket on the table and stared at it for a long time. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a clue. Frank always hid meaning in small things. I tried to remember his words from that week before he died. Something about keeping the house safe, no matter what. I thought it was sentimental talk back then. Now it felt like a message. I took out my notebook from the hospital bag and wrote one line, "Find the attic box." That night, I barely slept. I was already planning my visit. 2 days later, I told Dean I wanted to visit the neighborhood, just for fresh air. He looked uneasy, but agreed. He dropped me off near the grocery store and said he'd pick me up in an hour. As soon as he drove away, I crossed the street and headed toward my old house. My legs trembled, but not from weakness, from anger. When I reached the corner, I stopped. My house stood there, painted freshly white, a new car in the driveway, curtains closed. Someone else was living my life now. I stood across the street, pretending to wait for the bus. A woman walked out of the front door holding groceries. I didn't recognize her. My heart tightened, but I stayed calm. The windows upstairs were open, and the attic window just barely was cracked. The same one Frank had used when he'd fixed the roof all those years ago. The breeze moved the curtain behind it. I couldn't tell if it was a sign or a coincidence. I stayed until the woman drove away, memorizing every detail. Tomorrow I'd return when no one was home. That night, I sat by the window in the apartment, staring at the bus ticket again. It was faded, but the date still showed. August 22nd, 1999. I flipped it over and saw a faint smudge of handwriting, my husband's. It read, "Trust the paper." I didn't know what that meant yet, but I knew it mattered. I looked at the envelopes again, the unpaid bills, the mismatched addresses. They made one thing clear: the sale wasn't clean. My home was still tied to me somehow, and I would prove it, one piece at a time. I woke up early, packed a small bag, and put on a dark coat. I left a note on the table saying I'd gone for a walk. If they came looking, they'd think nothing of it. I took the first morning bus toward my old neighborhood. Every stop felt longer than the last. When I finally stepped off, I saw the street I'd known for 40 years. It looked different now, neater, quieter, almost too perfect. My house was still there, holding memories I wasn't ready to lose. I started walking toward it slowly, carefully. The sky was gray when I reached the front gate. The paint had been redone, but I could still see the small scratch Frank made when fixing the latch years ago. I stood there for a long time, breathing in the faint smell of lilacs. That scent had always meant home. Now it felt like a warning. I turned to leave, but a car pulled into the driveway. Karen stepped out, carrying a folder and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. That's when I knew she wasn't just part of it. She was leading it. I waited until Karen left before approaching the house again. I stayed across the street, pretending to check my phone while watching her car disappear. My knees shook, but I didn't move until she was gone. Then I took a step closer to the gate, noticing a small detail that others would miss: a key holder still nailed to the side post. It looked like they hadn't bothered removing it. I reached in and felt the empty space inside. No key. Still, it reminded me of how Frank used to hide things in plain sight. That night, I returned to the apartment with a mix of anger and exhaustion. I turned on the small lamp near the couch and saw my reflection in the window. My eyes looked older than before, but sharper too. I reached into my bag and pulled out the utility bill again. The address, the amount, the date, all still linked to me. They couldn't have transferred ownership without clearing that. It was sloppy work. I smiled a little. If they were careless, I could use that. I just had to find the proof before they found me snooping. I opened the envelope again and studied the fine print. The notice said final notice before transfer. That meant the sale wasn't fully processed yet. That also meant time was still on my side. I circled the date and underlined the account number. Then I placed it in my notebook, under the line that read "Find the attic box." I was building a quiet case, one small step at a time. People underestimate what an old woman can do when she's ignored. That was their mistake. They forgot who raised them to fight for what's right. The next day, Miles stopped by unannounced. He brought groceries and a smile that looked forced. He said he wanted to check in, but his eyes darted around like he was searching for something. When he left, I noticed he'd left an envelope on the counter. Inside was cash, too much for a normal visit, and a note that said, "Please don't make things harder." My hands trembled as I read it. He was scared, not of me, but of what might come out if I kept digging. That told me I was closer than they thought. That night, I couldn't sleep. The city outside was quiet, but my thoughts were loud. I sat by the window, staring at the moonlight reflecting off the bus ticket. I thought of Frank and how he'd trusted our boys. He always said families could rebuild anything as long as the truth stayed between them. I used to believe that. Now I wasn't sure. I opened my notebook and wrote another line. Truth first, family second. It wasn't the way I wanted it, but it was the only way to protect what he left behind. Morning came too early. I dressed carefully, wearing the same coat as before, and hiding my notebook inside. I took the bus again, but this time, I didn't get off near the house. I went straight to the local bank instead. I walked slowly to the counter, using my cane as support. When I handed my ID to the teller, she smiled politely and asked if I needed assistance. I told her I wanted to check my savings balance. When she pulled up the screen, I noticed her frown before she forced another smile. Something was off. She said the account had been recently modified. I asked what that meant. She couldn't say much, but I caught one word: joint. My stomach tightened. I asked if she could print a statement, and she quietly slid it across the desk. My name was still there, but another name had been added below it: Karen Parker. I thanked her, holding my breath until I was outside again. Karen wasn't just helping, they'd given her control. That explained the confidence, the fake kindness. I folded the paper carefully, like holding a piece of dynamite. I didn't go home right away. I stopped by the diner down the street, the one my friend Martha owned. The bell above the door jingled softly as I walked in. Martha smiled when she saw me and asked where I'd been. I told her I'd been recovering. She poured me coffee without another question. Martha had always known when not to pry. Still, when I asked if she'd seen Karen lately, her eyebrows rose. "She's been in here a lot," she said. "Always meeting someone in the corner booth." I thanked her quietly, my heart heavy. Martha went to serve another table, and I stayed at the counter, stirring my coffee without drinking it. The walls hummed with the sound of the fridge, the clinking of spoons and low chatter. I watched the corner booth where Karen supposedly sat. There was a faint stain on the seat from spilled coffee, still fresh. Whoever she met, it wasn't long ago. Then suddenly, the lights flickered, and everything went black. The hum stopped. Someone gasped. Power outage. In the dark, I heard a faint sound outside, the toll of a distant bell. That sound hit me like a memory. Frank used to ring a small brass bell in his workshop whenever he finished something important. It was how I knew to bring him tea. That same sound had been silent since he died. Hearing it again now made the hairs on my neck rise. It couldn't be real, but maybe it was a reminder. Maybe it was time to finish what he started. When the lights returned, I looked around, but no one else seemed to have noticed. I smiled faintly. I'd take it as a sign. I left the diner quietly, walking toward the bus stop. The cold air brushed against my face, and for the first time I didn't feel afraid. I had direction now. If the sale wasn't complete, if Karen had forged signatures, then there was still hope. I would find Frank's hidden box and whatever proof he left behind. I didn't know what was inside, but something in my gut told me it was important. My cane tapped against the sidewalk rhythmically, like a metronome, counting down to the moment everything would come out. That night, I stayed awake, waiting for the streetlights outside to dim. At midnight, I packed a flashlight and gloves, wrapped my scarf tighter, and slipped out of the apartment. The air was crisp and silent. I moved slower than I used to, but each step felt certain. The bus driver gave me a strange look when I asked to stop near my old street. I told him I was visiting an old friend. In truth, I was visiting the only part of my life that still felt real. My house, my secret, my proof. The neighborhood was sleeping when I arrived. Every window dark except one. Mine, the attic window, glowed faintly. A small flicker like a candle. I stopped, staring at it. Someone had been up there. My heart raced, but I couldn't turn back now. I slipped through the side gate, careful not to make noise. The grass was wet, the smell of soil and lilacs thick in the air. I moved toward the back porch, every memory replaying in silence. I had to know if Frank's secret still waited for me, or if they'd already taken it. The back door was locked, but the small cellar window wasn't. Frank had built it that way, in case we ever lost the key. I used the end of my cane to lift the latch and slid the window open. It creaked softly. I took a deep breath and climbed inside, one leg at a time. My body protested, but I pushed through the pain. Inside, the air was cool and stale. I could smell dust, wood, and something faintly sweet, like old honey. Everything felt exactly how we'd left it years ago. I turned on the flashlight and moved through the kitchen. The furniture was new, but the layout was the same. My hands brushed the edges of the counters, the same ones I'd wiped down every night. My heart tightened. I wasn't just looking for papers anymore. I was chasing pieces of myself. The floor creaked under my steps, echoing louder than I liked. I froze when I heard a car pass outside, its headlights flashing briefly through the curtains. I waited until it faded, then continued toward the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The stairs groaned under my weight. I took them slow, one at a time, remembering the nights Frank carried tools up here. When I reached the top, the air changed. It was warmer, heavier. My flashlight beam swept across boxes, old trunks, and cobwebs. I paused when I saw something odd, a thin red thread dangling from one of the rafters, catching the light. It looked deliberate. My chest tightened as I reached up and touched it. It was tied in a knot around a small nail, leading across the beam toward a loose floorboard. I followed the thread with my fingers, crouching beside the board. My knees ached, but I didn't stop. The thread disappeared into a small gap. I used the tip of my cane to pry the board loose. The wood cracked slightly, and a small puff of dust rose. Beneath it was a small metal box, the kind Frank used for his tools. My heart pounded as I lifted it. The latch was stiff, but it opened after a moment. Inside were yellowed papers, an old photograph, and a stack of postcards tied together with another red thread. I untied the thread slowly and flipped through the postcards. Most were blank, but one caught my attention. It was addressed to Frank from a lawyer. The date matched the year on the bus ticket, 1999. The message was short, mentioning that a property ownership transfer was never finalized. My eyes widened. If the transfer wasn't complete, then legally, the house was still mine. I clutched the card tightly, my hands shaking. Frank had known this day would come. He left everything right where I could find it. I whispered his name softly, thanking him. I took the papers from the box and scanned them. There were insurance documents, bank statements, and a few letters written in Frank's neat handwriting. He had written about debts he paid off quietly to protect the property. He must have been afraid something like this would happen. I folded everything neatly and placed them inside my bag. As I stood, the house creaked again. My light flickered. For a second, I thought I saw movement near the door. I froze, holding my breath, but when I looked again, the room was empty, just shadows and dust. I decided to leave through the same way I entered. The flashlight started to dim as I made my way down the stairs. My hands brushed the wall for balance. At the bottom, I paused to listen. Silence, the kind that felt too deep. I took one last look around the house before stepping outside. The night air felt colder now. The grass whispered under my shoes. I closed the cellar window behind me and walked toward the bus stop, clutching the box under my coat. I didn't know it yet, but the real battle was just starting. When I returned to the apartment, I sat down and stared at the box on the table. The red thread glowed faintly in the early dawn light. I opened my notebook and wrote down everything I found. The more I looked at those papers, the more I realized how much had been hidden from me. Frank had done everything to make sure I'd never lose that house. I made a silent promise right there. I would not let his work go to waste. I was tired of being treated like I didn't matter. That ended now. Later that morning, I went to the post office. I asked for a secure envelope and mailed copies of the papers to myself. It was an old trick my husband had taught me. Proof of date and possession. The clerk looked surprised, but didn't ask questions. As the envelope slid into the drop slot, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time since the hospital, I was in control. The game had changed. Now it was my turn to move the pieces. I walked out slowly, steady on my cane, but stronger inside. I stopped by the county records office next. The clerk behind the desk looked half asleep, flipping through papers lazily. When I asked about the deed transfer for my address, he typed for a while, then frowned. "It's still pending," he said. "There's some confusion with the signatures." I thanked him, trying not to smile. Confusion meant delay, and delay meant hope. I left the office feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The pieces were falling into place. I wasn't done yet, but I was finally one step ahead of them. On the bus ride home, I stared out the window at the moving streets. People rushed to work, kids walked to school, and no one had any idea what battles others were fighting. I thought about that word I'd read once, Sonder. The realization that everyone around you has their own stories, just as deep and complicated. I wondered if anyone ever thought about mine. Probably not, but that was fine. I didn't need the world to see me. I only needed my family to understand who they were really dealing with. When I reached the apartment, I unlocked the door and placed the box back on the table. I brewed a cup of tea and sat quietly, letting the steam fog my glasses. I wasn't angry anymore, just determined. I knew now that Karen hadn't finished what she started. The sale wasn't final, the deed wasn't valid, and I held the proof. I opened my notebook and wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Dinner. Everyone invited. It was time to bring them together, not for peace, but for truth. That night, I laid out everything on the table: the documents, the postcards, the bus ticket, even the red thread. Each piece told part of a story, but together they painted something bigger. I saw how carefully Frank had planned it all. He must have known someone would try to take what wasn't theirs. I thought about Karen's smug smile, about Dean's guilt, and about how easily Miles avoided my eyes. They thought I was weak because I spoke softly and moved slow. They forgot that quiet people remember everything, and I remembered it all. The next morning, I called the local lawyer listed on Frank's postcard. His name was Peter Lang. I told him I had some old papers to verify. He asked if I could come in that day. I hesitated for a moment, then agreed. I packed my bag, placed the documents inside, and took the bus again. The ride felt different this time, less like an escape, and more like a return. I was going to walk back into my past, not as a victim, but as someone ready to take back what was stolen. Peter Lang's office was small and smelled faintly of coffee and dust. He was older now, gray hair and sharp eyes. When I handed him the papers, he studied them carefully, occasionally humming. After several minutes, he looked up and said, "These are originals." My heart skipped. He explained that the ownership transfer Frank filed years ago had never gone through because the secondary party, me, never signed the release. That meant the house still legally belonged to me. I felt warmth rise to my face. For the first time in months, I truly had hope again. Peter made copies and told me to keep the originals safe. He said he'd file a notice to block any ongoing sale until things were reviewed. I thanked him and left, walking slower this time, not from weakness but from disbelief. All that pain, all that betrayal, and the truth was here all along, waiting in the attic. As I stepped outside, I saw the clouds part just enough for sunlight to hit the street. I stood there a moment, letting it touch my face. I wasn't finished yet, but I could finally breathe again. When I returned home, my phone rang almost immediately. It was Karen. Her tone was too sweet, too calm. She asked if I was feeling better and if I'd been out and about. I said I'd just gone for some errands. She didn't say much else, but I could hear the suspicion in her voice. She knew something had changed. That made me more careful. I checked the lock on my door twice before sitting down again. I had to stay quiet until everything was confirmed. I couldn't afford even one mistake now. That evening, Miles came by again, carrying groceries. His visits were becoming more frequent, but so were his excuses. I could see guilt written all over his face. He asked how I was holding up, and offered to help with anything I needed. I told him I'd manage. Before he left, I asked casually if Karen had mentioned the house lately. He froze for a second before saying she'd moved on. That lie was thin as air. I smiled and nodded. Let them think I was still in the dark. It gave me more room to move. As the days passed, I noticed small changes. Karen stopped calling for check-ins. Dean's texts became short and polite. Miles avoided questions about the sale entirely. The silence between us said more than words ever could. I started baking again, something to calm my nerves. Each morning I made tea, opened my notebook, and tracked everything they said or didn't say. I felt stronger every day, even if my body still ached. Truth had a way of healing things. I was finally ready to do what had to be done, face them all together. I decided to invite them over, not for confrontation, but for clarity. I called Dean first. He sounded surprised but agreed to come. Miles followed with hesitation, and finally Karen accepted last. I told them it was important family business. After hanging up, I looked around the small apartment. It wasn't much, but it would do. I cleaned the table, folded my documents neatly, and set out extra chairs. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. They thought I was gathering them to forgive. They had no idea what was waiting for them. That evening, I went for a short walk to clear my mind. The sunset painted the buildings gold and orange. As I walked, I thought about Frank. He'd always said people show their true faces when money's involved. I used to think he was too cynical. Now I knew he was just realistic. I passed by a bakery and saw a display of small cakes. Without thinking, I stepped inside and bought one. The woman behind the counter smiled and wished me happy birthday. I almost corrected her, but then I didn't. Maybe it was fitting after all. When I returned home, I placed the cake on the table and sat in silence. The room felt heavier than usual, filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. I thought about all the birthdays my family had forgotten over the years. It used to hurt. Now it just reminded me who I'd become, someone who didn't need their validation anymore. I lit a small candle and watched the flame dance. For a moment it almost felt like Frank was there beside me, proud and quiet. That thought steadied me. The day of the dinner came faster than I expected. I woke early, cooked a small meal, and set the table. I kept everything simple. No fancy dishes, just familiar food that reminded them of home. I wanted them comfortable before I shook their world. Around 7, the doorbell rang. Dean was first. He looked nervous but tried to smile. I welcomed him in kindly, offering him tea. He glanced around, probably searching for what I'd planned. I let him wonder. It was better that way. He'd learned soon enough that this dinner wasn't ordinary. Miles arrived next, carrying flowers. His eyes darted toward Dean, as if seeking reassurance. I could tell he wasn't in control of anything. He was just following along, too scared to stand against Karen. I placed the flowers in a glass jar and thanked him warmly. His hands were shaking when he handed them over. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Guilt was a heavy chain to wear, and he'd put it on himself. I poured him tea and told him to sit. He obeyed without question, avoiding my eyes. That said everything. Karen arrived last, as expected. She came dressed sharply, her perfume filling the air before she even stepped in. She smiled politely, complimented the apartment, and handed me a small gift bag. Inside was a candle. I thanked her, though both of us knew it meant nothing. She sat down with a confidence that didn't match the situation. I could see it in her posture, in the way she crossed her legs and scanned the room. She believed she'd already won. I let her believe that. The truth always hits harder when it's unexpected. Dinner began quietly. I served them one by one, watching how they interacted. Dean made small talk about work. Karen commented on the food, and Miles stayed silent. I nodded politely, answering little. I wanted them to feel safe, to think this was just a family meal. Halfway through, I stood up and reached into my drawer. I laid a small envelope on the table. No one spoke. They all stared. I told them it contained something I found while cleaning. My tone stayed calm. Inside was the copied document confirming the ownership delay. Dean blinked, confused. Karen's smile froze. Miles just stared at his plate. I told them I had been to the bank, to the records office, and even met with Frank's lawyer. Every word dropped like a stone in water, spreading ripples. Karen tried to interrupt, but I kept talking. I told them the transfer never went through, that the house was still mine. For a second, the room went dead silent. Then Karen laughed softly, saying I must be mistaken. Her voice cracked on the last word. She knew the truth had finally cornered her. Dean asked to see the papers, his voice trembling slightly. I handed him the copies and watched his expression change. His eyes darted over the signatures, the stamps, the missing notary seal. He looked up at Karen, realization dawning. Miles leaned back, looking between them both like a child caught in a storm. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. The silence did the work for me. It was strange, seeing guilt and fear share a table with me. For the first time, I didn't feel like the fragile one in the room. Karen stood up suddenly, her chair scraping the floor. She accused me of setting a trap, of trying to humiliate them. I stayed seated, calm as ever. I told her I simply wanted the truth. Dean tried to speak, but she silenced him with a glare. That's when I saw it. The cracks in her control. Her confidence was slipping. The more she raised her voice, the smaller she looked. She called me bitter, manipulative, and ungrateful. I let her say it all. The truth doesn't need defense. It just needs time to breathe. After a long pause, I reached for the small cake on the counter and placed it in the center of the table. I told them it was for me, a birthday I hadn't celebrated in years. The tension broke for a moment, replaced by confusion. I lit the candle and made a quiet wish. I didn't wish for revenge. I wished for understanding, for them to see what greed had cost them. I cut a slice, handed it to each of them, and took one for myself. It felt like closing a chapter that had stayed open too long. Dean's shoulders slumped. He looked tired, broken even. Miles looked ready to cry. Karen's face stayed cold. I told them I wasn't angry anymore. I was disappointed. I said Frank built that house, not as property, but as proof of love, something lasting. What they sold wasn't just wood and brick. It was every moment he'd worked for. They didn't answer. Karen stood, grabbed her purse, and left without another word. The door closed hard behind her. Dean stared after her, saying nothing. In that silence, I saw what was left of my family, just fragments. When they left, I sat alone at the table. The candle had burned low, wax spilling onto the plate. The smell of frosting mixed with smoke. I looked at the empty chairs and thought of how everything had led to this. All those years of love, trust, and sacrifice, traded for money that wouldn't last. But I wasn't broken anymore. I had faced them, and I'd done it with calm. I didn't need shouting or threats. I had the truth, and that was enough. The house might still be in question, but my dignity wasn't. Later that night, I placed the cake leftovers in the fridge and washed the dishes. The sound of running water was strangely comforting. I dried my hands and sat by the window again. The city lights shimmered below like scattered stars. I thought about Frank's words. How a person's strength isn't measured by how loud they fight, but how long they endure. I finally understood what he meant. My endurance had been tested, and I was still here. That was victory enough for now. I'd rest, because tomorrow there would be more to face. The next morning, I woke to a message from Dean. He wanted to meet alone. I agreed. We met at a small park near the courthouse. He looked tired, older than before. He said he was sorry, truly sorry. He admitted Karen had pushed him to sign things he didn't fully understand. He said he thought it was just a financial transfer, not the sale of the house. I listened quietly, watching his face. His words felt sincere, but I wasn't ready to forgive yet. Trust, once cracked, never fits the same again. Dean asked what I planned to do next. I told him I hadn't decided. He said Karen was furious, threatening legal action if I continued. I almost laughed. She couldn't threaten me with what wasn't hers. I told him I wanted peace, not war, but peace only comes with truth. He nodded, saying he wanted to help fix it. For the first time in a long while, I saw the boy I'd raised, the one who cared before money took over. Maybe this wasn't the end for us. Maybe it was just a painful beginning. After our talk, I walked back home, feeling lighter. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, leaves rustling like whispers of encouragement. The world felt softer somehow, as if it was giving me room to heal. When I reached the apartment, I made myself tea and opened the newspaper. There in the classifieds, I saw a small listing, property dispute, legal stay issued. It was my address. Peter had done it. Relief washed through me. The house couldn't be sold now, not until everything was reviewed. My home was protected, at least for now. That night, I stood on the balcony and watched the city lights again. Down below, people hurried home, unaware of the small battles others fought quietly every day. I thought of my sons, of Karen, and of the years we'd lost to pride and greed. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I whispered a small prayer of thanks to Frank for guiding me even now. The wind was cold but gentle, carrying the faint sound of a bell in the distance. It felt like a promise. The storm wasn't over, but I was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, I decided to bake again. It calmed me. I measured the flour, cracked the eggs, and listened to the quiet hum of the oven. The smell of sugar and vanilla filled the air, softening the tension that had hung in the apartment for days. I wasn't celebrating anything, not really. It was more of a reminder to myself that I was still here. The world hadn't beaten me yet. As the cake rose in the oven, I thought about everything I had survived: betrayal, loss, loneliness. Yet somehow, I still had fight left in me. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Peter, the lawyer. He said he had updates. Karen's name had appeared in multiple property transactions over the past year, all connected to the same real estate broker. It wasn't just my house. She'd been doing this for months. I listened quietly, the truth settling heavier with every word. Peter said he was filing formal complaints. I thanked him and hung up, my chest tight with a mix of anger and pity. Karen wasn't just greedy, she was reckless. And now her web of lies was finally unraveling. That night, I found myself pacing. The clock ticked louder than usual. I thought about calling Dean, but stopped. He needed to come to the truth on his own. I couldn't save him from guilt. He'd have to face it. I sat down and opened my notebook again. I wrote one sentence: greed grows fastest in silence. That was what had destroyed us. Everyone staying quiet while wrong things happened. I promised myself that silence would end with me. No matter how messy it got, I wouldn't stay quiet anymore. The next day, Dean came by unannounced. He looked pale and tired. He said he'd spoken to Peter and that Karen was furious about the investigation. I nodded but didn't say much. He confessed he didn't know the sale was illegal. He said he thought I'd already agreed, and that Karen handled everything. He sounded ashamed. I told him that forgiveness takes time, but the truth can start healing. His eyes filled with tears. I didn't comfort him. Not yet. Sometimes, people need to sit in the weight of what they've done. After he left, I went for a walk to clear my head. The air smelled like rain, and clouds gathered low over the horizon. I walked past the small park, where Frank and I used to sit every Sunday. I stopped at our old bench and ran my hand along the wood. It was worn and cracked, but still standing, just like me. I sat there for a while, letting the cool breeze wash over my face. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel angry. I felt steady, grounded in who I was before all this. When I returned home, I found a letter taped to my door. It was from Karen. Her handwriting was sharp and deliberate. She wrote that I'd ruined her life, that everything she did was to keep the family afloat. I folded the letter neatly and set it aside. There was no apology in her words, only blame. But beneath the anger, I could read the fear. She was losing control. I smiled faintly. People like Karen only crumble when they realize manipulation no longer works. and she was about to crumble completely. That evening, I brewed tea and stared at the letter again. It struck me how greed always disguises itself as justification. Karen would tell herself she did it for family, for stability, for love even. But lies wrapped in good intentions still rot the same way. I tore the letter in half and dropped it in the trash. The sound was small, but it felt like closing a door. I didn't need her words. The truth was enough. I had my documents, my proof, and most importantly, my peace, returning one breath at a time. The next morning, Peter called again. The investigation was moving fast. The county office had flagged Karen's transactions, and one of her partners had been arrested for forgery. He said Karen's name would likely come up next. I didn't feel joy, just relief. Justice was never sweet. It was simply necessary. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat in silence, staring at the papers on my table. All this chaos, all this noise, just because someone couldn't see value beyond money. Frank had been right. Some lessons only come after everything breaks. That night, Dean called again. He sounded different this time, clearer. He told me he wanted to help make things right. He said he'd spoken to Miles and they both agreed to sign statements supporting me. I listened quietly, heart swelling just a little. I told him that was good. He said he didn't want forgiveness yet, only to prove that not everything their father taught them was lost. I couldn't speak for a moment. Sometimes redemption doesn't need grand gestures, it just needs one honest choice. And for the first time, Dean had made one. The following week, Peter confirmed that Karen's assets had been frozen pending review. She'd disappeared for a few days. Rumors spread that she'd left town. I didn't believe it. People like her don't disappear, they hide. I spent the next few days cleaning the apartment, sorting papers, and keeping my phone close. Every knock on the door made me alert, but I refused to be scared. I'd already faced the worst of it. If Karen came back, she'd find a woman she no longer recognized, one who no longer feared losing what was already hers. Days turned into weeks. The investigation spread wider than anyone expected. Other families came forward. People Karen and her partner had tricked. It became clear this wasn't just personal. It was part of something bigger. I followed the news quietly, sipping tea in the evenings while the reporters spoke. I didn't celebrate, but each update felt like justice breathing again. Sometimes, life corrects itself in quiet ways. The wheel turns, and those who thought they'd never fall eventually do. I'd waited long enough for that turn, and now it was finally happening. One morning, I got a knock at the door. It was Miles. He looked thinner, nervous, holding something behind his back. When I opened the door, he handed me a box. Inside were old photos of our family, pictures from birthdays, holidays, small moments we'd long forgotten. He said he found them in Karen's closet, while helping Dean move her things out. I thanked him, my throat tight. The past stared up at me through those faded prints. The boys had been so small then, smiling beside Frank. For a moment, all my anger melted. Miles stayed for tea. He said he couldn't sleep since the dinner. He admitted he knew more than he let on, that he suspected Karen's plans but didn't stop them. He said he felt trapped, afraid to lose everyone. I told him fear can make good people do foolish things, but the important thing is what we do next. He nodded quietly. He asked if I could ever forgive him. I didn't answer. Forgiveness wasn't something you said, it was something you lived into. He'd have to earn it, one day at a time. After he left, I spread the photos across the table. Some were faded beyond repair, but others looked almost new. One photo showed me and Frank standing in front of the house when it was first built. I traced the outline of the window where the red thread had hung. I realized then that maybe Frank left it not just as a clue, but as a reminder of connection, of strength, of how everything in life ties together eventually. I smiled softly. Maybe it was his way of making sure I never forgot who I was. That night, I made myself a small dinner, then sat by the window as the rain began to fall. The rhythmic tapping on the glass was comforting. I wrapped myself in a blanket and watched the streetlights blur through the raindrops. Everything outside looked softer, quieter. I thought about how far I'd come, from waking in that hospital bed to reclaiming my life piece by piece. It wasn't over yet, but I'd already won something far more valuable than the house. I'd found my voice again, and I wasn't losing it ever again. The following morning, Peter called again with news. He said the court had officially frozen the house sale until ownership was resolved. That meant I was safe for now. I thanked him and promised to visit soon. When I hung up, I stood still, letting the relief sink in. It was strange how quiet victory could feel. No celebration, no applause, just peace. I looked around my small apartment and smiled. Even this place, borrowed and temporary, felt more like home than anything built on lies. Truth has a way of cleansing spaces. Later that day, Dean visited again. He brought groceries and a small plant for my windowsill. He said Miles had started helping him sort through their finances, trying to untangle what Karen left behind. He looked tired but determined. We sat in silence for a while, drinking tea. He finally said, "I don't deserve your kindness." I told him kindness isn't about who deserves it. It's about who needs it. His eyes filled with tears. For the first time since this began, I saw him not as the man who betrayed me, but as my son again. That night, I placed the plant by the window and watered it gently. The leaves shimmered under the lamp's glow. It felt symbolic somehow. New life growing where hurt had lived. I thought of how Frank used to plant things, even in the worst soil, believing everything could bloom with care. Maybe he was right. Maybe this family, broken as it was, could still grow again. It would take time and patience. But I wasn't afraid of that. I had both now. The air smelled fresh, carrying the faint scent of rain from outside. A few days later, I met Peter again at his office. He handed me new documents showing the legal stay in place. He said it was only a matter of time before the property was restored under my name completely. I thanked him sincerely. Before leaving, I asked if he remembered Frank well. He smiled and said Frank was one of the most honest men he'd ever met. Hearing that made my throat tighten. I walked out of the office into bright sunlight, clutching the papers like a promise fulfilled. I could almost feel Frank's presence beside me. On the way home, I stopped at a small park again. Children were playing, their laughter echoing across the open field. I sat on a bench and watched for a while. It reminded me that life continues no matter how heavy our losses feel. There's always movement, always renewal. The thought brought me comfort. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living again. I took a deep breath and smiled softly to myself. Maybe that's what Frank wanted all along, for me to find peace, even after everything. And maybe, finally, I had. When I reached home, I found another envelope under my door. This one wasn't from Karen. It was from the court. I opened it carefully and read the first line. It confirmed that an investigation into fraudulent signatures was underway. The sale was suspended indefinitely. My name, Edith Parker, was listed as the rightful owner pending verification. My knees nearly gave out. I sat down slowly, holding the letter close to my chest. After everything they took from me, I finally had it back, proof that truth still mattered, even in a world that often forgot it. That night, I placed the official letter on the table beside the red thread and bus ticket. Those small things had guided me back to this moment. I lit a candle and whispered a quiet thank you to Frank. The flame flickered gently, casting soft light across the room. The house wasn't just walls and floors, it was our story, stitched together by love and memory. I wasn't going to let greed erase that. As I watched the candle burn, I realized something simple yet powerful. Sometimes, reclaiming your past is how you save your future. The next morning, Dean called to say that Karen had turned herself in. She was facing charges for fraud and forgery. I felt no triumph, only relief. Some endings don't need revenge, they just need closure. Dean said he wanted to visit later with Miles, to talk about what happens next. I agreed. When I hung up, I looked at the quiet apartment around me. It wasn't my real home, but it had been my refuge. And now, soon, I'd go back, not just to a house, but to a life that was rightfully mine. I spent that afternoon packing a few things, organizing my papers neatly in a folder. I wanted everything ready for when the time came. Each folded shirt, each photo, each note felt like reclaiming another small piece of myself. I stopped for a moment to rest and glanced at the plant by the window. It had grown taller, a new leaf sprouting overnight. I smiled. Life has a way of growing through cracks. No matter how hard people try to bury the truth, it always finds sunlight again. I was living proof of that. As the sun set, I made myself one last cup of tea and sat on the couch. I thought about everything that had happened, from that hospital bed to this quiet moment of peace. I had faced betrayal and found truth, faced greed and found strength. I'd lost faith in my family, but not in myself. The window was open slightly, and the sound of the evening wind carried through the room. I closed my eyes, breathing it in. The storm had passed. What remained was calm, steady, and mine to keep. Dean and Miles came by that evening, just as the sky turned orange. They both looked uncertain, like boys visiting the principal's office. I invited them in and poured tea. Dean started talking first, explaining that they wanted to make things right. Miles nodded, saying they had already spoken to Peter about transferring everything back. I listened quietly, watching their faces. They weren't lying this time. The guilt had softened into honesty. I told them I appreciated it. There was no need for punishment anymore. Sometimes, remorse itself is the only justice that matters. Dean handed me a small envelope. Inside were the keys to my house. He said the locks hadn't been changed yet, and the property was legally on hold. His voice shook slightly when he told me it was still mine. I held the keys in my palm, their weight familiar and comforting. I looked at both of them and saw something different this time, not guilt, but relief. They had carried the truth too long, and finally, they were letting it go. I thanked them softly. No shouting, no anger, just a quiet ending to a loud betrayal. After they left, I sat with the keys on the table. The metal glinted under the lamp, a symbol of what had been stolen and returned. I traced the edges with my fingers, remembering every sound that house ever made, the groan of the stairs, the hum of the fridge, the wind against the old windows. I realized it wasn't just a building, it was proof that truth could outlast lies. I closed my hand around the keys and smiled faintly. Tomorrow, I'd go back. Not as a victim, but as the rightful owner of my own story. That night, I could barely sleep. My mind replayed everything: the hospital, the discovery, the attic, the dinner, the letters. Each piece felt like a chapter in a book finally reaching its last page. I lay awake listening to the ticking clock, counting each second until morning. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. When the sun rose, I got up, dressed simply, and packed my bag. The bus ticket from 1999 was still in my wallet, creased and faded. I carried it with me like a talisman, Frank's quiet reminder that some promises never die. The ride back to my neighborhood felt like stepping into a memory. Every street looked both familiar and foreign. The trees seemed older, the colors softer. When the bus stopped near my street, I stepped off slowly, clutching the keys in my coat pocket. My heart beat fast, not from fear but from gratitude. After everything, I was still standing. I walked toward the house, my steps steady. From a distance, it looked smaller than I remembered. But maybe it was just me who had grown. I took a deep breath and reached for the gate. The gate squeaked the same way it always had. The sound made me smile. I walked up the path, running my hand along the fence, where Frank once hung the wind chimes. The air smelled faintly of lilacs again, though they hadn't bloomed in years. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was quiet, filled with the faint echo of time. Dust floated in the sunlight, streaming through the windows. I set my bag down gently. This wasn't just coming home, it was reclaiming everything they thought they could erase. I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen tiles were still chipped in the corner. The living room still had that uneven floorboard Frank never fixed. Every imperfection felt precious now. I ran my hand along the mantel and found an old photo frame turned backward. Inside was our wedding picture, faded but whole. I laughed softly, tears burning my eyes. They hadn't even noticed it was there. I placed it upright and smiled at Frank's young face. I whispered, "We did it," and for the first time in a long while the house felt alive again. As I walked upstairs, I paused by the attic door. The red thread still hung from the rafter, just as I'd left it. I didn't move it. It belonged there, a silent witness to everything that had happened. I touched it lightly, feeling the roughness against my skin. It reminded me of resilience, how even something fragile could hold when tied strong enough. I closed the attic door softly and stood for a moment, breathing in the stillness. Every scar this house carried was now part of its story, and every scar I carried matched it perfectly. When I came back downstairs, I sat by the window and opened my notebook. The pages were filled with my handwriting. Dates, names, notes, fragments of memory. I flipped through each one until I reached the last blank page. I wrote, "Home reclaimed, truth intact." Then I closed it for good. This wasn't about revenge or even justice anymore. It was about peace. I finally had what I needed: the truth, my strength, and my home. The rest could heal in its own time. I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the sunlight warm the floor. A few days later, Dean visited again with papers from Peter. The house was officially reinstated under my name. He handed me the documents. Eyes red but smiling, he said this time he wanted no share, no credit, just forgiveness. I didn't promise it, but I nodded. Forgiveness was already quietly growing inside me, even if I wasn't ready to say it out loud. I made him tea, and we sat together without needing many words. He was my son, and though trust would take time, I knew we'd find our way back slowly. That evening, I opened the metal box from the attic again. I wanted to see everything one last time. The postcards, the lawyer's letter, the insurance forms, all the pieces that had saved me. Underneath them, I noticed something I hadn't before. A folded note tucked beneath the false bottom of the box. My heart jumped. I unfolded it carefully. It was Frank's handwriting, small and neat. The note read, "If you're reading this, it means you stood your ground. Don't let them forget who you are. Love always, Frank." I pressed it to my chest and cried. Those words broke something open in me. For so long, I had felt small, dismissed, powerless. But Frank had seen the truth in me long before anyone else. I looked around the house, the same place we built together, and realized he had left me more than a home. He'd left me courage. I whispered his name softly, promising to keep that courage alive. The walls seemed to breathe with me, the creaks and hums now sounding like quiet approval. It felt like he was still here, watching over the life we had fought so hard to protect. The next morning, I went outside and stood on the porch. The grass was damp from rain, glistening under the sun. I could hear distant laughter from neighbors, children playing down the street. For the first time in months, I smiled without effort. The pain had softened into memory, and the bitterness had faded into understanding. I realized that winning back my home wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about remembering who I'd always been, a woman who endured, who built, who loved deeply and never gave up. That was the real inheritance Frank left behind. Later that day, Dean and Miles returned, this time bringing small boxes from the apartment. They helped me unpack and stayed for lunch. We talked quietly about ordinary things, the weather, work, small-town gossip. It felt almost normal. I caught them, glancing around the house, their faces soft with nostalgia. Miles said it still smelled like Dad's aftershave in the hallway. Dean smiled faintly and said he could almost hear Frank's whistle. I didn't correct them. Maybe they did. Sometimes, love leaves echoes you can still feel if you listen closely enough. As the day ended, they said goodbye and promised to visit often. I stood at the door, watching them walk away. The house was quiet again, but not empty. It was full of peace, of memory, of second chances waiting to bloom. I sat by the window, sipping tea, as dusk settled outside. My reflection in the glass looked older but lighter, like a woman who'd finally set down a heavy load. I whispered a simple prayer of thanks to Frank, to the truth, to time itself, for bringing me home again. If you've stayed with me through all this, you probably want to know what comes next. Don't worry, I'll tell you soon. So make sure to stay close. You won't want to miss how this story ends. The next morning, I woke to the sound of church bells echoing faintly through the air. Their rhythm was slow and familiar. I smiled, remembering how Frank used to time his morning coffee by those bells. I sat up and stretched, sunlight spilling across the floor. Today felt different. I had no more papers to sign, no more confrontations to plan. Just a quiet day ahead, the kind I used to dream of. I made breakfast, humming softly to myself. Peace, I realized, wasn't a gift. It was something you had to earn, one truth at a time. After breakfast, I walked through the house again, this time without tension. Every room felt lighter, every shadow warmer. I opened the windows wide, letting fresh air in. The curtains danced gently in the breeze. I stood in the doorway of the living room and whispered a thank you to the walls, the floor, the roof. All of it had protected me, even when I thought I'd lost everything. Maybe homes have memories too. Maybe they know who truly belongs inside them. The thought made me smile. It felt like the house was smiling back. That afternoon, Dean called to say that Karen's case had moved forward. She had pleaded guilty to fraud and forgery. She'd avoid prison if she cooperated, but her reputation was gone. I thanked him for letting me know. After hanging up, I sat down and stared at the photo of our family on the mantel. I didn't feel hate anymore. I just hoped she found her own truth someday, even if it took losing everything to see it. Sometimes, pain is the only teacher that stays long enough for us to finally listen. As the sun set that evening, I walked out to the porch again. The neighborhood was quiet, except for the distant sound of crickets. I leaned against the railing and looked out at the streetlights, flickering on one by one. It reminded me of the nights Frank and I used to sit there talking about the future, never imagining how it would all unfold. I realize now that endings aren't always sharp. They can be soft too, like the slow dimming of light. That was how I wanted my story to end, quietly but meaningfully. Later that night, I found the small notebook where I had written everything down. I flipped through it slowly, reading my own words like someone else's story. Each page held a piece of who I was, frightened, determined, angry, and finally free. I tore out the last page and wrote one new line, peace restored. Then I closed the notebook for good and placed it back in the attic box beside Frank's note. The red thread still wrapped around it gently, tying the past and present together like one continuous heartbeat. The next morning, I decided to visit the small church at the end of the street. I hadn't been there since Frank's funeral. The bell tower looked the same, worn but strong. I sat in the last pew and listened to the quiet hum of air through the stained glass. I didn't pray for anything specific. I just sat in gratitude. I realized that even when everything else was taken, faith had never left me. It had only gone quiet until I was ready to hear it again. That silence had saved me more than I knew. On my way home, I stopped by the market and bought fresh bread, honey, and tea leaves. The shopkeeper smiled and asked if I was hosting company. I said maybe soon. It felt good to say that. To imagine people filling my home again with laughter and warmth. I carried the bag home, humming softly. The air outside smelled like new beginnings. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. Whatever came next, I knew I could face it with grace and steady hands. When I reached the house, I noticed a small package on the doorstep. No name, no return address. I brought it inside and opened it carefully. Inside was a small brass bell, the same kind Frank used to ring in his workshop. My breath caught. I looked around, half expecting someone to appear, but there was no one. Just me, the house, and the sound of my heartbeat. I placed the bell on the mantel and gave it a soft ring. The clear tone filled the room, warm and familiar. It was like hearing Frank's voice one last time. That night, as the wind whispered outside, I sat by the fireplace with a blanket around my shoulders. I thought about everything, the betrayal, the courage, the faith it took to keep going. I had walked through pain and come out whole. I realized I didn't just reclaim my house. I reclaimed myself. Every scar, every tear, every quiet moment of strength, it all added up to something unbreakable. I closed my eyes, listening to the faint echo of that brass bell still lingering in the air, and smiled through the quiet. Before going to bed, I stepped outside one last time. The sky was full of stars, brighter than I'd seen in years. The cool air carried the smell of rain on distant asphalt. I thought of the bus ticket still tucked in my wallet and how it had started everything. One small piece of paper that led me back to my truth. I whispered a final thank you to the night, to Frank, to the world itself for giving me another chance. Then I turned off the porch light and went inside, finally at peace. The next morning, sunlight poured through the windows like a gentle welcome. I brewed coffee and stood in the kitchen, looking out at the garden. The lilacs had begun to bloom again, small and bright. I hadn't planted them this year. They'd come back on their own. I smiled, realizing how life always finds its way back, even after being neglected. I opened the back door and stepped outside barefoot, feeling the cool grass under my feet. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was living again. Dean and Miles visited that afternoon, bringing groceries and tools. They wanted to help fix up the house, repaint the porch, and repair old things Frank had left unfinished. Watching them work side by side reminded me of when they were little, building toy forts in the living room. I stayed on the porch, handing them paintbrushes and lemonade. The air was filled with small talk and quiet laughter. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was healing. Family, I realized, isn't about never breaking. It's about choosing to rebuild, no matter how messy the pieces are. As the day ended, Dean handed me an envelope from Peter. Inside were final papers confirming everything: my ownership, the cleared title, the legal closure. It was over. Completely, finally over. I stared at the paper. My name printed clearly at the top. The fight that had consumed months of my life had reached its end. But instead of triumph, I felt calm. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it just sighed softly and settled in your heart like peace. I thanked Dean, folded the paper neatly, and placed it beside Frank's note on the mantel. Later that evening, Miles fixed the old light on the porch while I cooked dinner. I made simple food: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and warm bread. The smells filled the house like old times. When we sat down to eat, no one spoke for a few moments. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, almost sacred. Dean raised his glass of water and said quietly that he was proud of me. I smiled and said I was proud of us, because somehow, against all odds, we'd managed to come back from the edge, together. After dinner, they stayed to help clean up. When the dishes were done, we stepped outside to the porch again. The night was cool, the stars shining brightly above. Dean pointed to the sky, saying how Dad used to name constellations for them. Miles laughed softly, remembering the stories Frank used to make up. I listened, heart full, as they shared memories that had slept for years. Maybe that was Frank's real gift. Not the house, not the papers, but the reminder that stories hold families together long after everything else falls apart. When they finally left, I stayed on the porch a while longer. The crickets sang, and the air smelled faintly of rain. I thought about everything I had lost, and everything I had gained. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had carved space for strength I didn't know I had. The house wasn't just mine again. It was proof that endurance mattered. I looked at the front door, freshly painted, the brass handle gleaming under the porch light. It looked like a beginning, not an ending. I whispered a thank you to the night and went inside. In the living room, the small brass bell caught the light from the lamp. I picked it up and rang it once, just to hear its tone. The sound was soft and clear, echoing faintly through the house. I imagined Frank smiling somewhere, watching me keep everything he built alive. I set the bell back on the mantel and felt an ache in my chest, not of sadness, but of love that refused to fade. I finally understood what he meant when he said home was never about walls. It was about the people strong enough to protect it. The following morning, I started working on the garden again. The soil was rough, but I didn't mind. I planted seeds where the flowers used to be, humming softly as I worked. Each seed felt like a promise, a small act of hope buried beneath the earth. The sun warmed my back, and I felt lighter than I had in months. I wasn't just tending to plants. I was tending to peace, nurturing something that would outlive the pain. Healing doesn't arrive all at once. It grows quietly, root by root, day by day. Later that day, the mailman dropped off a letter. It was from Karen. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside, she wrote that she was sorry. She admitted everything, said she was getting help, and asked for forgiveness. I read it twice, unsure how to feel. There was no anger left in me, only sadness for how far she'd fallen. I didn't reply. Some apologies don't need answers, they just need to exist. I folded the letter, placed it in the drawer, and whispered a quiet prayer for her. That was enough. That night, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I watched the rain start again. It fell steady and gentle, tapping against the glass like a familiar rhythm. The house felt alive around me, humming softly with the sound of water and wind. I thought about Frank's note, the red thread, the bus ticket, all the small things that guided me back. They weren't coincidences. They were reminders, proof that love doesn't disappear. It just changes shape, waiting for us to notice it again when we need it most. In the following weeks, the house came back to life. Dean repaired the roof. Miles repainted the walls, and I planted herbs in the kitchen window. Neighbors started stopping by again, offering smiles and fresh pies. The laughter that filled the halls didn't feel borrowed anymore. It belonged here. One morning, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized myself. Not because I looked younger, but because I looked peaceful. The worry lines were still there, but they told a different story now, one of survival, forgiveness, and quiet triumph. One afternoon, I decided to bake again. I made 2 cakes this time, one for the family, one for the neighborhood kids who often waved at me through the fence. When the oven timer dinged, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the kitchen. It was joy, pure and simple. I decorated the cakes with simple icing and set them by the window to cool. The house smelled sweet, like childhood. It felt like a message to the universe. I'm still here, I've survived, and I can still create something beautiful from what remains. That evening, a soft knock came at the door. It was Dean, holding a small box. He said he found it among Dad's things at storage. Inside was a photo album I thought I'd lost forever. I flipped through it slowly, page after page of our lives. The house under construction, birthdays, holidays, laughter frozen in time. At the very end, there was a photo of Frank and me standing on the porch. On the back, in his handwriting, were 5 words. You'll always find your way. I smiled through tears, feeling that truth settle deep inside. Later that night, after Dean left, I sat in the living room and opened the window to let the evening air in. Fireflies blinked across the yard, tiny sparks of light dancing in the dark. I thought of how everything had come full circle, how the same place that once broke my heart had become my healing ground. Life, I realized, doesn't erase pain. It weaves it into something softer, something meaningful. I whispered goodnight to Frank and to the house itself. It felt like both were listening, keeping me company in the quiet. A few days later, I found the old bus ticket again. It had fallen behind a book on the shelf. I picked it up and studied the faded date, August 22nd, 1999. That day would have been our anniversary. Frank must have known I'd find it eventually. I smiled, realizing that even in death, he had found a way to guide me back home. I placed the ticket beside the brass bell on the mantel, a small shrine to everything we'd built and everything we'd overcome. Love, it seemed, had its own way of keeping promises. The next morning, I heard laughter outside. The neighborhood kids were playing near the garden. I waved to them, then cut a few slices of cake and carried them out. Their eyes lit up as I handed them plates. Their laughter filled the air like music. Watching them run through the grass, I realized something simple but profound. Life always renews itself. Even after betrayal, even after loss, there's always something pure left to hold on to. I looked at the house, the flowers, the children, and felt Frank's words echo in my heart. That night, I sat in my favorite chair by the window, a soft blanket over my lap. The brass bell and bus ticket gleamed under the lamplight. I thought of everything, the lies, the truth, the forgiveness, the peace. I had come so far from that hospital bed, from that helpless moment when I thought I had lost everything. Now I had more than I ever imagined, not wealth, not perfection, but meaning. And maybe that's all we're meant to find in this life, something worth fighting for, something worth forgiving for, something worth coming home to. Weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, I walked outside to the porch with my coffee. The sky was pale blue, streaked with early sunlight. I watched birds gather near the garden, pecking gently at the seeds. The world looked ordinary again, and that was its own kind of miracle. Ordinary days, after everything I'd faced, felt like a blessing. I realized that I didn't need grand endings or second chances to feel whole. I just needed moments like this, quiet, real, and earned. Sometimes peace is simply the sound of your own heart resting. That afternoon, Dean came by one last time with the final signed confirmation from the court. Everything was officially settled. He hugged me before leaving, and I felt the years of distance melt away in that simple embrace. When he drove off, I stayed on the porch, the wind gently brushing my face. I thought about how every wound had led to this, every scar, every sleepless night, every tear that watered the seeds of strength. Nothing was wasted. Every moment had been part of the journey home, and now the journey was complete. That night, I baked one more cake, just for myself this time. As it cooled, I poured a cup of tea and set a second cup across the table. I imagined Frank sitting there, smiling the way he always did when he caught me baking late at night. I raised my cup toward his invisible presence and said softly, "We did it." The clock ticked in the quiet. The air smelled of vanilla and peace. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone, and never really had been. Some loves simply change form, but they never leave. The next morning, I found a single red thread tangled on the kitchen counter. I picked it up, smiling. It must have fallen from the attic box, but somehow it felt like a message. I tied it gently around my wrist and looked at it gleam in the morning light. It reminded me of connection, of how even fragile things can hold the strongest truths. I decided to keep it there, as a promise to myself. Whatever came next, I'd carry my story proudly, one thread of courage woven through every day ahead. In the days that followed, I started writing again. Not in my notebook of evidence, but in a clean journal. I wrote about life, about love, about how easy it is to forget your own strength until life tests you. I didn't write to publish or share. I wrote so my grandchildren would someday understand who I was. Not the fragile old woman in the hospital, but the one who stood her ground when no one else did. Every word I wrote was a seed planted for someone else's courage to grow. One evening, as I finished writing, I heard the distant sound of church bells again. Their tone was soft and low, carrying through the twilight air. I stood at the window, eyes closed, letting the sound wash over me. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a continuation, like a heartbeat echoing through time. I whispered quietly to Frank, "I kept your promise." The bell rang once more, clear and bright, then faded into the wind. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything I'd learned, everything I'd reclaimed. That night, I locked the doors and turned off the lights. The house glowed faintly under the moonlight, peaceful and still. I walked slowly to my room, the red thread glimmering faintly on my wrist. I lay down, listening to the steady hum of the night. Outside, the rain began again, gentle and rhythmic, as if the world was rocking me to sleep. I thought of all the versions of myself I had been: wife, mother, survivor, and finally, whole. My eyes grew heavy, my heart steady. I smiled, knowing the story was complete. The next morning, the sun rose softly over the neighborhood. The house stood quiet and proud, its windows glowing gold. In the garden, the lilacs swayed gently in the breeze. On the porch table, a single teacup sat beside the brass bell, both catching the light. Inside, the air was warm, filled with the scent of flowers and faint vanilla. Edith Parker had found her peace. She had come home, not to a house, but to herself. Because sometimes losing everything is what it takes to remember what was truly yours all along.